Greetings, fellow travelers through the liturgical year. This is Lisa Davis with another Feast Day Quick Take on the feast of Saint Anthony the Great. Or is it Saint Anthony of Egypt? Or Saint Anthony of the Desert? Or Saint Anthony the Hermit? Or Saint Anthony of Thebes? Actually, it's all of the above, and all descriptive monikers that distinguish today's saint from the other most famous Anthony, Saint Anthony of Padua. But Saint Anthony the Great, the hermit from Thebes, famous for his long life in the desert of Egypt, unlike Saint Anthony the beloved Franciscan, the finder of lost articles, is one of the fathers of the early church, specifically one of the desert fathers, which is just one of the categories of fathers of the church. A fascinating side topic about which the venerable authors of the '07 Catholic Encyclopedia wax eloquent, over 18 pages of tiny print. But for our purposes, we can extrapolate. In a nutshell, for a saint to be included in the list of fathers of the church, 4 major characteristics are necessary. First necessity is, of course, personal sanctity. He must be a saint. And I say he because, yes, of course, they are all men. It is fathers of the church of which we speak. Then, doctrinal orthodoxy is an absolute. There must have been no question, scandal, or wishy-washiness in his teachings, ever. Next, to be defined as a father figure whose influence helped establish the foundation of the church, a saint must have antiquity, meaning that he must have lived before the 8th century. The death of St. John Damascene, which was around the year 750, is traditionally regarded as the end of the age of the first fathers. And the last qualification, a church father must have come down to us with the implicit approval of the church, in other words, by popular acclaim and tradition. You might remember we talked about the title Great on the feast of St. Gregory the Great. We'll link to that in the show notes if you missed it. The title, Father of the Church, has evolved in the same way as the attribution Great, and not coincidentally, we find some overlap of greats and fathers, just as in today's saint. But there is no official exhaustive list of the fathers of the church. There has never been a committee charged to vet saints for the honor. There is no application process, no accreditation. There is only the requirement that the honor has withstood the test of time. In other words, 2 millennia of critics and skeptics have not diminished the sanctity and influence of these men we call fathers of the church. And aside from our own perceptions, if God didn't will it, these great saints would have lost the title long ago. To add a bit more background, the fathers of the church can be listed in 4 columns. We have the apostolic fathers, among whom we count St. Clement, St. Ignatius, and St. Polycarp. We have the Greek fathers, such as St. Athanasius, St. Gregory Nazianzus, St. Basil, and St. Chrysostom. And the Latin fathers. Can you guess any? The first usually noted are St. Ambrose, St. Jerome, St. Augustine of Hippo, and Pope St. Gregory the Great. These 4 actually make up their own special subcategory, not just church fathers. They're commonly referred to as the Great Church Fathers. A couple other of the Latin fathers that we can't not name are Pope Leo the Great and a personal favorite, St. Isidore of Seville, who is the patron saint of the internet, the first great encyclopedist, and the inventor of punctuation. There's a quick take on him too, if you'd like to look him up. Then, last but not least, we have the Desert Fathers, which includes notably St. Paul of Thebes and today's saint, St. Anthony of the Desert. Because St. Anthony, among all his other titles, is known as the Father of Monasticism, it's an easy error to assume that he was the first monk. But the biography of St. Anthony written by St. Athanasius makes it clear that St. Anthony was neither the first hermit nor the first monk. He was certainly one of the earliest hermits, though, and he was instrumental in spreading the concept of monasticism, due to the fame he received in his lifetime and the group of holy monks he gathered around him in one of, if not the first, semblance of monastic life. It must also be said that his influence on the spread of monastic life was also due in no small part to the biography written by St. Athanasius. His book, The Life of St. Anthony, was translated into Latin before the end of the 4th century, and was as widely shared as a book could be before the invention of the printing press. Over the centuries, having been translated into many languages, it became a standard, one of the best known works of literature in the Christian world, retaining its popularity all the way through the Middle Ages. It's from this biography that we know St. Anthony was born in the year 251 AD to wealthy landowners in a town called Coma, located in Lower Egypt. We know his parents died when he was only about 20 years old, leaving all the family property and his little sister to his care. But young Anthony's care was not for worldly things. Diving headlong into his Christian faith after the close-up view of mortality he experienced at his parents' deaths, he took seriously the lesson about the camel and the eye of the needle. Found in the 19th verse of Matthew, quote, "If thou wilt be perfect, go sell what thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." And so St. Anthony did just that. He gave away part of the family land to his neighbors, then sold the rest, donating the proceeds to the poor. His sister, whom we assume was of like mind with Anthony, he left with a, quote, "group of Christian virgins." Today we would say she became a nun. For the next 15 years, Anthony served a sort of novitiate, living the life of a hermit not far from his home in Coma. In this time he learned the ropes, so to speak, of the spiritual life from various ascetics, trying to learn from each of them the virtues at which each excelled. There are legends that during this time he worked as a swineherd, which accounts for his special patronage of pigs and folks who raised them. During this first foray into the hermit life, St. Anthony advanced in the spirit of prayerfulness as well as in the practice of mortification, maintaining a very strict and spare diet. It's said he ate only bread, salt, and water, and never meat or wine. He ate but once a day, sometimes fasting up to 4 days. An interesting note to checkmark if you're contemplating an intermittent fasting diet, or question the Catholic penitential practice of fast and abstinence. Though our longevity is certainly the will of God, take it for what it is. St. Anthony lived to 105. His friend St. Paul, who also lived the life of an ascetic, lived to the great old age of 114 years. After about 15 years, around the age of 35, St. Anthony felt called to a greater isolation from the world. According to the Catholic Ot 7 Encyclopedia, quote, "He crossed the Nile, and on a mountain near the east bank, then called the Pispir, now Der el Memun, he found an old fort into which he shut himself, and lived there for 20 years, without seeing the face of man, food being thrown down to him over the wall. He was at times visited by pilgrims, whom he refused to see, but gradually a number of would-be disciples established themselves in caves and huts around the mountain. Thus a colony of ascetics was formed, who begged Anthony to come forth and be their guide in the spiritual life. At length, in about the year 305, he yielded to their importunities and emerged from his retreat. And to the surprise of all, he appeared to be as when he had gone in, not emaciated, but vigorous in body and mind. For 5 or 6 years he devoted himself to the instruction and organization of the great body of monks that had grown up around him. But then he once again withdrew into the inner desert that lay between the Nile and the Red Sea, near the shore of which he fixed his abode on a mountain where still stands the monastery that bears his name, the Dermar Antonius. Here he spent the last 45 years of his life, in a seclusion not so strict as at Pispir, for he freely saw those who came to visit him, and he used to cross the desert to Pispir with considerable frequency. The Life of St. Anthony by St. Athanasius says that on 2 occasions he went to Alexandria. once after he came forth from the fort of his spear to strengthen the Christian martyrs in the persecution of 311, and once at the close of his life around the year 350 to preach against the Arians. St. Jerome places his death in 356 or 357. The encyclopedia continues, at his own request his grave was kept secret by the 2 disciples who buried him, lest his body become an object of reverence. Alas, in spite of St. Anthony's humble intention, it seems that it was God's will for the relics of this holy hermit to be honored, for the honor that they did to God. In the year 561, St. Anthony's remains were miraculously discovered and moved to Alexandria, and then after some time, out of necessity, they were moved again to Constantinople when Muslim invasions threatened. And here is where we get to relate a tale of knights in shining armor. In the 11th century, about the year 1074, a knight named Jocelyn de Chateauneuf, the son of the lord of La Motte Saint Didier near Lyon in central France, was miraculously cured of a lethal disease after promising St. Anthony that, regardless of the danger and inconvenience, he would find his relics and bring them back to France. Remember, the relics of St. Anthony had been taken for safety to Constantinople, which had been in the hands of Christians for some time. But by 1071, a large part of Byzantium had been conquered by the Turks, and many worried about the threat to Constantinople. The First Crusade was right around the corner, but no Christian armies were headed toward the Holy Land yet. So the onus was on Sir Jocelyn, and Sir Jocelyn alone, to be true to his promise, preferably before the Crusades started, to find the relics of St. Anthony. So it seems to have been the will of God that Sir Jocelyn, as the story goes, would have to slip into Constantinople and figure out a way to beg, borrow, or steal the relics from the current Byzantine emperor. And the ancient tale gets foggy right about here. I'm not sure how intrepid Sir Jocelyn managed it, but in the Orthodox account, an emperor named Basil the Bulgar Slayer is somehow involved. And I can't tell you how much I'd love to know how exactly this was resolved, but all we know is that the relics did indeed return to France with Sir Jocelyn. They were placed in the church of La Motte Saint Didier, not far from Vienne, which was a Benedictine priory at the time. Once they were safely set aside, Sir Jocelyn began the task of building a church specifically for the remains, but died before the church was even started. His brother-in-law, it is said, laid the cornerstone, but the church, the Abbey of St. Anthony, which can still be visited today, wasn't finished until over 200 years later, in 1297. It's fairly certain that the relics of St. Anthony remain there to this day, though it's also reported that in 1491 some were removed to the church of St. Trophimus in Arles, and no doubt, as is usually the case, other relics can be found in various churches throughout Christendom. Now, to share some of the wonders of St. Anthony the Great of the Desert, Father of the Church, and incidentally, one of the 4 holy marshals of Rhineland. Here you go, Kevin. Did you know that along with St. Quirinus, St. Cornelius, and St. Hubert, St. Anthony held a special place in the hearts of the Germanic people? Similar to the 14 holy helpers, the 4 holy marshals of God were considered to stand particularly close to the heavenly throne, and were revered, especially in the Middle Ages, as powerful intercessors, especially against disease and epidemics. Which segues to a very specific disease whose cure seems to have been a specialty of St. Anthony's. There's a terrible condition known as ergotism, which is basically a poisoning caused by the eating of improperly processed rye or other grains. Its symptoms range from hallucinations and convulsions to terrible cramping and gangrene in the extremities. It's almost always debilitating and very often deadly, and because it's a problem that originates with the food supply, its effects can be widespread, affecting the unsuspecting who have bought grains in good faith. After St. Anthony's miraculous healings of such outbreaks, his name became connected with the scourge, and as it happens, was remembered over many centuries by sufferers who called on St. Anthony for cures. In about the year 1095, after his son was miraculously cured of the condition by the use of a relic of St. Anthony, a nobleman named Gaston of Valois founded a congregation called the Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony, who specialized in this condition, which ironically became known as St. Anthony's Fire. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Hospital Brothers' chief protocol to combat ergotism was prayer, careful nursing, and the application of the holy relic of St. Anthony, and they were very often successful. In the 15th century, the brothers turned their focus of necessity to nursing those afflicted with the plague, and thereafter, for many centuries, the monks specialized in diseases of the skin, until the remnant of the congregation was disbanded at the time of the French Revolution. But St. Anthony the Great is still available as the patron saint against complaints of the skin, and it seems we might also turn to him for help in conditions caused by unhealthy foods. Now, wonders of another variety. According to St. Athanasius' biography, the devil tried to overcome St. Anthony by many means of temptation, some that we all experience, like boredom, laziness, and other faults of pride and hedonism. But our good saint, overcoming these enticements by the power of prayer and sacrifice, God permitted the devil to attack St. Anthony in actual physical ways for the humility and grace he'd thereby merit. St. Athanasius records that there was a time when St. Anthony took for his shelter a place among the tombs outside the village of his birth, a place that turned out to be a particular penance for him, as the cave he'd found was chock full of demons, so many demons beating him so mercilessly that he was found at one point by a chance passer-by to have apparently been beaten to death. No spark of life could be found in his bruised and bloody body. Friends and family were notified. They carried him to the town, and gathered in sorrow, expecting to soon bury him, when in the night, after all the watchers had fallen asleep, except his one particular comrade, St. Anthony opened his eyes, sat up, and demanded to be brought back to the cave. Now, having just seen the holy hermit apparently resurrected practically from the dead, his friend didn't argue but obeyed his wishes, carried him back to the cave, and watched in wonder as Anthony, barely able to stand, leaned on a boulder and called out to the demons inside. Basically, he taunted them, daring them to show their faces, and he even sang to them these words: "Though a camp be set against me, my heart shall not be afraid." And, quote, "In the night they made such a din that the whole of the place seemed to be shaken by an earthquake, and the demons, as if breaking the four walls of the dwelling, seemed to enter through them, coming in the likeness of beasts and creeping things, and the place was on a sudden filled with the forms of lions, bears, leopards, bulls, serpents, asps, scorpions, and wolves. And each of them was moving according to his nature. The lion was roaring, wishing to attack. The bull seemed to toss with its horns, the serpent writhing but unable to approach, and the wolf, as it rushed on, was restrained. Altogether, the noises of the apparitions with their angry ragings were dreadful." End quote. His friend cowered, turning to run, but St. Anthony remained firm and fearless, continuing to reproach and belittle the demons until just before the creatures could leap, a brilliant light flashed and the demons vanished. Anthony knew, of course, that the light had come from God, and he asked, and how can you blame him, where God was the first time the demons attacked him. God's reply, quote, "Antony, I was here, but I waited to see your fight. Wherefore, since you have endured, and hast not been worsted, I will ever be a succor to you, and will make your name known everywhere." And so he has. Once, when St. Anthony was on his journey in the desert to find St. Paul of Thebes, who had been brought to his attention by God in a dream, the story goes, and I'm abridging here, our saint ran into two demons on the way, in the form of a centaur and a satyr, apparently desiring to scare St. Anthony from his holy quest. Instead of reacting with terror, however, St. Anthony asked for directions. The centaur tried to speak in an unintelligible language, but ultimately, perhaps forced by the will of God, it pointed with its hand toward the path to St. Paul, and then immediately vanished from sight. And so, finding St. Paul's hidden hermitage, a great saint was made known to the world, as no one before this miraculous visit knew about St. Paul. And it was only just in time, as it was not long afterward that God brought St. Paul to his heavenly reward. Another time while traveling, St. Anthony was surprised to find in his path a plate of silver coins sparkling in the sun. Knowing instinctively that the coins were another attempt to tempt him into vice, he voiced aloud the foolishness of such an obvious trick, and the silver vanished. But apparently the devil believed the old adage that every man has his price, or at least he thought it was worth a try. And not much further down the path, St. Anthony almost tripped over a pile of gold coins, which he stepped over as if they were no more than a pile of stones, and whereupon the coins disappeared. Shortly afterward he had a vision where the whole world was covered with snares and traps. Seeing the difficulty for all mankind, Anthony prayed, saying, "O good Lord, who may escape from these snares?" And the voice of the Lord answered, "Humility shall escape them." In his life of humility and mortification, St. Anthony forged a steep but strong ladder, practically straight up to eternal life, leaving behind a legacy of faith and wisdom that became cornerstones of monastic life. But his words of counsel and encouragement that have come down to us through the centuries apply to everyone, no matter the station in life or the century they live in. Here are a few of these counsels to leave you with the sound of his voice. One is a prediction often heard in our time. Quote, "A time is coming when men will go mad, and when they see someone who is not mad, they will attack him, saying, 'You are mad, you are not like us.'" He tells us how to defeat evil. Quote, "The devil is afraid of us when we pray and make sacrifices. He's also afraid when we are humble and good. He's especially afraid when we love Jesus very much. He runs away when we make the sign of the cross." And who would know better than St. Anthony? He gently rebukes us. If we make every effort to avoid death of the body, still more should it be our endeavor to avoid death of the soul. There is no obstacle for a man who wants to be saved other than negligence and laziness of soul. End quote. That said, we should be patient with our progress and persistent. He tells us, "The fruits of the earth are not brought to perfection immediately, but by time, rain, and care. Similarly, the fruits of men ripen through ascetic practice, study, time, perseverance, self-control, and patience." But he warns us, "Expect temptation to your last breath." And he makes it clear that we are never alone in our trials. And we'll sign off with this comforting reminder. Quote, "You should know that there is present with you the angel whom God has appointed for each man. This angel, who is sleepless and cannot be deceived, is always present with you. He sees all things and is not hindered by darkness. You should know, too, that with him is God." End quote. Saint Anthony of the Desert, Father of the Church, pray for us. Blessed be God in his angels and in his saints.